even though we're not technically into the course material. This is a way of framing the course material, or rather a way to avoid framing the course material, okay? I've noticed with some of you already that you brought into this class kind of your own pre-existing assumptions about what imperialism is, or what the subject matter of this course is. Everybody does that to a certain extent, but what I'm seeing that concerns me a little bit is that some of you may already have switched off in terms of the ability of any of this material to reach you. And when this happens, it really has been starting to happen pretty frequently. It's most commonly people who, when they're faced with this kind of subject matter, kind of take wonderful delight in shredding European powers and or the United States, that they give you some sort of joy to do. That's not really the purpose of this class. And if you'll notice, you know, just the how reading, but also you'll notice in the Kennedy book, and when we look at, you know, Reinhardt and people like that, they're trying really hard not to stake out an ideological position from which to try to persuade you. They're trying to analyze, and so am I, all right? So this idea of this reflexive notion that, for example, you know, how it deals with it, well, imperialism is about white people enslaving non-white people. We know that's not true, because it doesn't explain the Ottoman Empire, it doesn't explain China, it doesn't explain Japan, it doesn't explain Dahomey, it doesn't explain the Mfecani in Southern Africa, it doesn't explain anything, okay? And in fact, it is racist, okay? But more than that, when you start sort of glibly tossing around words like exploitation and, or as Hal points out, the word colonization, right, is suggesting that we use that term so broadly and so impressionistically that it ceases to function at all. It really doesn't mean anything anymore, okay? That's what he's trying to encourage us to avoid. I mean, one of the things that I hope you're getting out of Hal's chapter is this relentless kind of frustration. How the hell can I teach this stuff or write about this stuff when we can't even agree on our terms, okay? Well, yeah, I kind of share that. And what makes it worse, though, is when people go off into their own little silos and decide, I don't care what this person's writing, or I don't care what this clown in front of me is teaching. I already know the answer. And the answer is Europeans are evil. Or the answer is, you know, the third world is nothing but victims. First of all, that, again, it's condescending and racist. It really is. And as you see, when we get deeper into this, it's ahistorical. It does not take into account the existing history of empires and colonialism, okay? And so I'm really just asking you to try to set aside those closed door conclusions in your mind. Just kick those doors open just a little bit, maybe let a little light in. I'm not trying to change your minds. I'm just trying to reach them, okay? That's the most important distinction I'm trying to make here. So I can't tell you how to think. I'm just trying to get you to want to think. And you can't think if you've already made your mind up. So I'm just saying, let's try to be aware that there is a propensity for us sometimes to do that, okay? It's not an indictment, it's not a judgment, but it is a legitimate concern. I'm just gonna tell you all straight up, you do not have this figured out. You don't. How doesn't have this figured out? I don't have this figured out. That's why the class is important. We're still trying to figure it out. But if you're sitting there and you sort of, you know, psychologically fold your arms and say, no, I've got this figured out and I know what's right and I know what's wrong, you're wasting everyone's time, but most particularly, you're wasting your own, okay? You're enrolled in a class for which you are not studying. And you're not going to be able to persuade me or any other conscientious educator by making strident ideological arguments or using vernacular or something like that. You're gonna have to show that you can think. Otherwise, this class is gonna be a burden for you. So I'm just letting you know, heads up, that I'm keeping my mind as open as I can. Okay, if I can do it at my age, you can do it at yours. Okay, so that was pretty important. Now, what I wanted to do, and again, this may not take us very long. What I hope you're getting from Stephen Howe's chapter, and again, it's hard because it's just the introduction to a somewhat larger book. First of all, is this theme of ambiguity and frustration that he's wrestling with. I mean, if you look at, it's funny, I was just looking at it again. The subject is so highly charged with political passions and emotion that can make the historical study of empires frustrating. But then he adds, but is also part of what makes it ever mobile and exciting. So he's trying to say, look, if you're gonna walk around in this environment, right, then one of the things you have to understand is this isn't easy. It is not easy. Okay? And drawing conclusions is fraught. Okay, you can make all kinds of mistakes by drawing conclusions. He's being really honest about this, I think, as a scholar, in a way that one of the things I was really drawn to with Howe's coverage of this was he really seems to be fighting for integrity here. You know, he's not trying to change anybody's mind. He just wants to start the discussion, right? But he does draw some conclusions in terms of, he says, okay, this is the way I'm going to try to look at it. And I would suggest to you that the first and maybe the most important dynamic of what he's talking about is often framed in terms of this asymmetry of core and periphery. Okay? Does somebody want to tell me what you think he means by that? And why he might think it's important?
So I think it's important to understand like what the dominating like culture, the main culture, the one that expanded outwards, and how they exploit those cultures or systems on the periphery of that original empire, of that original territory, from what I'm understanding.
Well, I would suggest, Johanna, that you're correct up to a point, but what Howe is trying to get us to do is take a step back before that. Before we look at how, he's also interested in why. Because we know that there are, in other words, it isn't about, he's making this clear, race is a component of empire and colonialism, but race isn't the reason for it. It's not. It's the justification for it often after the fact. That's his position, and I think he makes a pretty compelling case. Also, here's the challenge. You cannot go anywhere in the planet and be away from racism, not anywhere. And yet, in history, let's say the last 5,000 years of recorded history, there have been really remarkably few of what we might recognize objectively as empires. So that would suggest that racism isn't what drives people to empire. It can sustain that drive, and more importantly, I think we've talked about, it can give you a moral justification for it. Okay, but you know, Johanna's right when she says there's this idea of understanding sort of who's the exploiter and who's the exploited. Howe has a concern about that, though, about that perspective. He has, and again, he doesn't always say these things clearly because he's trying to be even-handed, but do you get a sense of what his concern is about just sort of making a dichotomy of the colonizer and the colonized as being sort of separate, and or the exploiter and the exploited being the beginning, middle, and end of the story? Jennifer, were you going to say something, or you look like your box lit up there? I guess not. Okay. Anybody else?
Oh, I was.
Go for it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that there's certain empires that, to some extent, either help or integrate the peripheries, like into their system, or they allow them to culturally exist in a larger degree, and they don't like simply oppress them, I guess.
Well, yeah. In other words, what Howe's trying to suggest is that we really have to try to resist oversimplification, because we lose some of the important nuances in all the different modalities of empire and colonialism. And therefore, one of the things we lose is the capacity to compare them meaningfully, or to determine at what point does something become not merely a migration or an expansion or a movement or a migration or an immigration, but becomes in fact empire. Okay, so the modalities of exploitation are clearly part of the profile of the empire. But he's trying to get us to understand that not every empire rules at the barrel of a gun, okay? Not every empire in history, not every empire simply goes in, destroys all of what was, and then completely paves it over with their idea of what should be. That's not accurate historically, but more importantly, Believing that or acting as though you do obviates some of the motivations that drove people to empire in the first place. That's what he's trying to say. Okay.
Well, he does mention that the concept of European expansion was driven by new investments, or at least that it's still debated. So that seems like it's still a hotly contested issue, where it's like it seems to be about the accumulation of wealth or new resources, but that it's still not like a solid definition of it.
No, again, we're not necessarily trying to define as we are trying to be more precise. Okay. The thinking being, if we can strip away faulty assumptions that maybe apply in some cases, but not all, we will be left with something like a definition. This is, by the way, what he tries to do in that first chapter. And if you look at the last, what is it? I think it starts on page 30. He actually gives you these nice bold face. Here's the concept. Here's, when you read my work, I want you to be thinking about it. Understand that I'm thinking about it this way, okay? But part of it is that idea that, and we talked about this a little bit in the last class period, there's no evidence that people will expand outward simply because they want to kill, or because they want to rape and pillage, or because they want to oppress people who are inferior to them. They're not driven to do that except when they have two things. One, an imperative to do it. Two, the capacity to do it. Okay, so this notion of imperative and capacity is really important. Okay, if you think about, for example, a lot of people don't really understand the history of Alexander, and the expansion of sort of what we might call early Greek imperialism. Okay, in much of that history, this sort of young, volatile, dynamic, student of Aristotle is going out and expanding outward, but he's largely following a trajectory of commerce, among other things. So there's always been a commercial element of all of this. It's more than just merely we want wealth. There's a certain way we want to go about getting it. And it isn't necessarily going and killing people. See, what complicates this is that some people have pursued a kind of imperial strategy in part to try to obviate or minimize the likelihood of war, okay, and thereby facilitate commerce. So sometimes this is born out of contested lanes of commerce. There might be certain safe passages across the Sahara, or certain, most historically important, certain safe passages across the Atlantic. And the ability to use those in order to do what Johanna suggested, and some scholars are saying, is to enhance the capacity to create wealth. Okay, those things become very important. That's a powerful incentive for people to go out looking and see what they can find. But then you have to have the capacity to do it. What gives people capacity? Think about, for example, the period of empire with which most of us, however imperfectly, are probably most familiar, really begins in the 16th century. It really does. Right at the end of the 15th, but really the 16th century. What are the major changes that we're seeing in the world?
You need the agricultural capacity.
You just went quiet there, Paul. You started talking to me.
I said you need the agricultural capacity to sustain a large population, for one.
Well, that had been around a long time. Notwithstanding the fact that England, for much of that history, was always on the brink of starvation. But I mean,
yeah,
we had domesticated agriculture thousands of years prior to that. Okay, that had been around for long.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I want to agree with what somebody was saying in chat, where it's like, didn't England become like a major seafaring power along with Spain around that time? This is not exactly what they were saying, but I remember
yes and no. Yes and no. Who was the dominant maritime power in the voyages of discovery?
Spain and Portugal.
Yeah.
Portugal, then Spain, then the Netherlands, then England. England was a late bloomer in that sense. Okay, so one of the things that's important here is this capacity to develop certain kinds of technology. Okay, in other words, building ships properly took human beings a while to figure out. Now, we know, or we have reason to believe, although the documentation is spotty, that there were the equivalent of much earlier voyages of discovery. Some of them may have come out of Asia. Some of them may indeed have come out of coastal Africa. We're just not sure, okay? We know the Vikings were rolling around and doing the silly things they do. There was a lot going on, but we know that from the 16th century on, the notion of global empires really became permanent. Now, whoever held the trophy might change, okay? Somebody mentioned the Phoenicians, absolutely. And see, the problem there is we have an imperfect history. Much of it is prehistory or problematic history. It's improperly translated, it's improperly interpreted, but you see what I'm saying? In other words, that capacity to expand because of what you know about travel on the sea becomes very important. And it's really two things. One is just the technology of ocean-going craft. It starts out with coastal craft, because then what you're exploring is up and down the coast. When you look at the early voyages of the Portuguese in sub-Saharan Africa, all they're doing is going up and down the coast. But all they're doing is establishing new trading routes, new avenues for the exploitation of resources, most conspicuously human capital, slavery, okay? But it's also giving us a sense of what the rest of the world looks like in terms of its geography, its physiognomy, everything else, okay? But again, that's with just traveling coastally. What's more powerful, some scholars argue, the single most transcendent capacity of empires beginning in the 16th century was the capacity to master the Atlantic Ocean, okay? To project your power across the Atlantic Ocean, okay? Because what that does is it connects you to another world, okay? If you just look at a world map, you can see how that might be considered to be another world. But to use the Atlantic to go to the so-called New World, the Americas, whatever you want to call it, but also to use the Atlantic to go to China or to go, through to Asia and things like that. And what that requires is, first of all, ships that are capable of extended periods of blue water sailing, that is just bottomless ocean sailing. Blue water sailing is when you're out in the middle of nowhere, okay? And also the capacity to navigate that blue water. It's not just that the boat will stay afloat and the sails work. That's hard enough. But that the boat is constructed such that you can support a crew and the food it needs to feed them and everything else. All of those things are these formidable challenges, beside which nothing will work if you can't navigate. Okay, so what's happening is partly because of a number of other things that are happening in one of them being the advance of science and the movement out of the Dark Ages, right, through the Renaissance, is we're either discovering or rediscovering things that we either knew but weren't using or had forgotten and now learned again about how to use, celestial navigation, for example. That changes the world. When you can take readings from the stars and know where you are from that, and not only that, know how far you traveled in a day. Okay, that's extraordinary, and that gives you tremendous capacity, particularly where the Atlantic Ocean is concerned. Okay, so as many of you pointed out, the first European power to make extraordinary use of that would have to be Portugal, closely followed arguably by Spain. And then everyone always forgets the Dutch, but they were there and they had these incredible ships that were very durable. They were big and kind of funny looking, but they were surprisingly agile, quick, and had great capacity, right? And then finally, and for the longest time and most successfully, the British Empire. All of those things were a consequence of this capacity to navigate the Atlantic Ocean and thereby project force all over the world. Okay, so that's something to be thought about. Now, when we get into the next module and you read Wolfgang Reinhardt, he talks a lot about this. He talks about what made the difference, and what he talks about is what he calls a development gap. What I'm trying to suggest is that what he's talking about with development gap is part of what Howe and others are talking about with core and periphery. One of the things from that point of view that would designate the core is the advantage in that asymmetry of development gap, okay? But as you'll see when we get into Reinhardt, he's not talking about some people being superior to others. He's just saying, just strictly in terms of the developments you need in order to project your power, there's a gap. between those who colonize and those who do not, or those who create empires and those who do not. Okay. So that's, I think, the most important thing to think about here is this notion of asymmetry. It's very difficult for equal powers to colonize each other. In other words, we never colonized the Soviet Union. They never colonized us. Okay. I wouldn't say that we really colonized Great Britain, even though they had created us as their colonies. But once we became sovereign, they can't colonize us, because that's what Reinhardt talks about, is that development gap simply doesn't exist. That degree of asymmetry does not exist. Okay. Now, if you have the book in front of you, please do this. If not, it starts at page 30. The first thing he wants to define is empire. Okay, this is on page 30. How does he define an empire? And this is, I think, we're more or less going to stay with his terminology, but we're going to bend to fit a little bit. We're going to analyze things. Did anybody in your notes or anything? So one of you at least made notes of that where you took his definitions. That was, yeah, AJ, I'm sorry.
Thanks, AJ.
I have the PDF open. You said the book, and I pulled out the decolonization book and got really confused. But you're talking about the.
Oh, you've done that again. We're still on how.
Yeah, we're still on House. It's a different book, one I don't own.
Per the Moodle site, by the way.
I know.
Johanna, were you going to say something? Did you get stepped on?
No, I mean, one, I did the exact same thing, but two, no, I think what Hal was talking about was empire can be described as a large political body which rules over territories outside of its original borders.
Okay, well, here's what he says.
It's further, I think. There's a large composite multi-ethnic or multinational political unit usually created by.
Okay, now Kyle's mumbling through these incredibly important distinctions.
That was not Kyle.
Is that, yeah, I think it was. Was it not? Kyle, was that not you?
Go for it.
Never mind.
I'd know that voice anywhere. He sounds like my oldest son. Anyway, let's take those one at a time, Professor Peterson, because they're all valuable, my son. All right. First of all, it's large. What do we mean by large? How large is large? How large is space? Well, it's big. It's really big. But large, again, in what sense? There's an easy answer to this. It's extraterritorial. That is, it's beyond what is normally recognized as your geographic situation. So you're projecting force over land, think of the empire that was China, or you're projecting force over the sea. All the major modern, more or less modern, let us say capitalist empires in particular. All right, so it's large. What does he mean by composite? He says composite, multi-ethnic, or multinational. Again, this obviates the claim of many that every empire is just squeezing all the life out of people and just substituting your own. Howe is pretty emphatically saying that's not accurate. AJ, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to add that it included some sort of diversity. There had to be a multi-state kind of thing going on. There'd be a lot of different groups involved.
Well, to add to that, it'd also be like ethnically, nationally, or culturally, or religiously diverse, right? Like, because when you expand, you're still taking over like those different like cultural norms, religious norms, et cetera, that are already present in that culture.
Right, because one of the things, and here's where Howe maybe doesn't help us quite as much, but again, it is an introductory chapter. One of the things he tries to get us to understand is, look, it's not common, even with this development gap that Reinhardt talks about, that we'll get to, downstream a little bit. It's not that easy to just go in and conquer people and make them mind. People can be surprisingly resistant and resilient. I mean, even Machiavelli warns about that. The risks of trying to impose your rule on other peoples outside your own, principality. It's fraught with peril. It requires violence. It can exhaust a principality. It can compromise the power of the prince. It can unmake your power if you do it wrong. Part of that then is, and Howe has to sort of reluctantly admit this, violence. There's going to be violence. And there's going to be a monopoly of coercive violence. By the way, which is the same fundamental ingredient of a modern nation state. The modern nation state is characterized in part by possessing and maintaining and using a monopoly of coercive violence. Okay. If you don't have that, you can't hold a modern nation state together, or so the concept goes. But the kind of diversity we're talking about, as a couple of you suggested, it can be multi-ethnic, and it is often multi-religious. any of you ever done any history on the Raj in India, that period of time in India, where British colonialism really, one of the things you'll notice there is that India did not become Britain. Far from it. Far from it. Indeed, part of the characteristic of the Raj was these British would-be aristocrats and most of the military people, right, would go to India. They would begin to marry into those families, the Brahmin class. They would begin to adopt a lot of the diet, the dress, the habits, and things like this. And that wasn't superficial. That was significant, okay? Because there's never been an empire that we know of that was more emphatic about insisting upon its civilizing mission, its right to rule, its clear superiority to the rest of the peoples of the world. And yet, we see throughout their empire, but particularly in places like India, that they're adapting as much as they're transforming others. They're adapting to others as much as they're transforming. And it's all problematic, and it's all undergirded by force. Of course it is, But in other words, Howe's trying to get us to think about the complexity of empires. Don't make them simple things, because they weren't. If they were simple things, everyone would have one, but they don't, okay? So that's the first thing. Look at his definition of empire. Imperialism, I think we defined this in the last class. It's essentially, he says here, is the actions and attitudes which create or uphold an empire. All right, so when you're trying to remember what that is, in other words, less obvious and direct kinds of control and domination by one people or country over others, okay? So you can have different kinds of imperialism, he suggests. You can have cultural imperialism. A lot of people would say that the United States is relentlessly exercising cultural imperialism. That is, simply by the export of our media produce, right, our media product, that we're actually kind of propagating a cultural empire. And we found, most interestingly, that, one of our biggest potential victories there, but one of the biggest obstacles, is the largest country in the universe, which is China. And they are in part acting like someone resisting imperialism by setting up quotas on the number of motion pictures that can be produced in the United States and screened in China, and a lot of other things, right? But that's what people mean by cultural imperialism. Now, obviously, for our purposes, the most compelling kind of empire here would be what I think Johanna was suggesting, that is a political empire, one that really involves the projection, the meaningful projection of the capacity to govern from a distance, from core to periphery. Again, typically with the idea of expropriating from that periphery all those things of value to which you now feel entitled and of which you can now make productive use, or claim that you can, right? So by the way, am I losing you or am I making sense? It's just that I got the feeling that a lot of you haven't had a chance to read this yet. So I thought maybe we better walk through at least his conclusions a little bit. Okay. Now, when he talks about, I'll leave it to you to glance at he talks just briefly in passing about the concept of dependency, the concept of globalization, all that. Then he talks about colonialism. Okay. And colonialism is strictly political for him. This is where the literary criticism notice of, the kind of postmodern notion of colonization really frustrates him, okay? Because it is explicitly political, right? Systems of rule by one group over another, where the first claims the right, all right, a right usually established by conquest, to exercise exclusive sovereignty over the second, or, the colonized, and to shape its destiny. See, that's pretty powerful. In other words, some people would have you believe, all right, you see this a little bit in critical race theory and in critical theory in general when it's applied to things like colonialism, that any attempt by any people to influence or persuade any other people is an attempt to colonize them. Well, no, it's not, because persuasion isn't domination. They're very different. And if we lose those nuances, none of these concepts have any meaning, which inhibits our ability to understand the world. So he's not just quibbling because he's old school or something. What he's saying is we've got to try to be precise with the way that we apply these terms. And I've seen in some of his other works, he's really frustrated with what he sees as this kind of piracy of ideas you know, in a lot of the critical theory that's come out. Now, I'm not quite as hostile to that, but it is frustrating when you go to a conference or something and you have people who are throwing out words like colonization or exploitation or the things that we normally think about with, you know, the kind of empire we're talking about here. They're free to do that. That's fine. But they themselves forget that what they're using is they're using these terms as metaphors. They can't mean them literally because they don't fit literally. It's, in other words, the distinctions matter. And it's not just yes, no. You think of it as a kind of continuum. That is, on one end of the continuum is, you know, people writing novels in a certain language, hoping that you know, people will understand that in that language, and then other people saying, well, you're trying to sell your novels in English here because you're trying to colonize our minds. No, you're trying to sell books.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm a little confused. Okay. I have a question. I'm one of those people who apparently has to change the way they think now, because
No, I'm not asking anybody to change.
I thought that no, with the way I approach this class. I should
Okay.
Bad choice of words there.
Okay.
So a country going, I have that terrible internet, so I probably have a bad delay. I apologize. But let's say the British, you know, going into India and taking control. That's not domination. They're persuading them to work together.
No, that's not at all what I said.
Imposing their
Wait a
rule.
minute, Jennifer,
I don't.
that's not at all what I just said.
Oh, wait.
Not at all, not remotely.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What I was saying is your words drag. So. Okay. What Hal is trying to say, what I'm trying to kind of translate from Hal is absolutely that is domination. It is explicitly political. It is the explicit projection of political and economic power to the advantage of the colonizer. That's an empire. That's right. What he's saying is the example I used before. Okay. If you're writing in a language, if you're writing in English, okay, but maybe you live in a state like California, which is now sort of minority white in a sense, but you continue to write in sort of not only English, but white American vernacular or something. And people are going to say, oh, don't buy those things because they're trying to colonize us. You will hear people using that kind of language. It's nonsense. That's what he's saying. It's nonsense. What I'm saying is it's a metaphorical warning to people to kind of look before you read or look before you commit and be aware of the power of language to influence people. Just hear that your power of language is an architecture, okay? But it's not at all the same thing as, Jennifer, what you just described. The British going into India and saying, okay, there's a new sheriff in town and he's us. That's colonialism. That's explicit and intentional domination. In other words, what he's trying to do is make sure that you understand there are nuances to this that are meaningful. There are distinctions that are meaningful. And one of them is this idea of things being superficial or maybe influential or interesting hybridization or something, as opposed to, no, we are dominating you. You are inferior to us. Okay, they're not the same thing, and the differences matter. That's all he's trying to say. That's all he's trying to say. Yeah.
Okay, I get you now.
Yeah, and again, let me just kind of reinforce what I'm not trying to do here. I don't want any of you to change what you believe in or to change your minds. I really mean this. I mean, if you walk out of this class seeing the world the same way you did when you walked in, that doesn't bother me, as long as you understand why. And what I'm suggesting is looking at this stuff as objectively as we can manage, right, is going to allow us to see more clearly why we see the world the way we do. You don't have to believe, none of you should be under any obligation, even to pretend that you believe and accept as absolute gospel anything that any of these authors is saying or that I'm saying. But it is important that, just like I do, I've assigned you readings here with which I disagree. Okay, there's much in Hal with that I would go a lot farther. Okay, but this isn't about me. It's about what is the prevailing scholarship right now, at least that which I can read in English or in translation from German or something like, you know, a Reinhardt. So no, I'm not trying to get you to change your minds. All right, now let me just, we're almost done here. When he talks about colonization then, okay, what he's talking about is large-scale population movements where the migrants maintain strong links with their or their ancestors' former country. Okay, think about the Americans before independence as colonists. Their stronger tie was to England. There was no American identity to speak of. Okay, clearly they were different and changes were underway. But you know, people forget that the grievance of the colonists in the Declaration of Independence was not that they were denied their rights as Americans or as individuals. It was that they were denied their rights as Englishmen, you know, I mean, the male term being used then, right? But in other words, as English citizens, they had rights that they had been denied by the Parliament and the Crown. That was their grievance. Okay, that's an important distinction. They still saw themselves largely as organically connected with the center, with the core, as a natural extrapolation of that core into the periphery of the New World. It was only after that, with the end of that and the beginning of the American Republic, not even the Articles really, but finally the consolidation of the Republic, that you see an aggressive attempt to develop a sense of a national identity and a national sense of purpose and a national economy, completely as distinct from, and even in some cases antithetical to, the British identity, economy, you know, polity, whatever, okay? It is at that point only that you cease to be a colony, that you cease to be colonizers, and you become, in other words, you claim for yourselves, no, we are residents, this is our home. We are no longer, none of you, I think, thinks of yourself as English or as German or whatever your ancestry is. None of you really accurately thinks of yourself as that, okay? What he's talking about is when you have a significant migration of people from one place to another, maintaining the stronger ties with the place from which they came rather than the place to which they go. This is typical of colonizers. Mimi writes about that in his really interesting book of Colonizer and Colonized. And he talks about the kind of dual identity that people have, because on the one hand, you can get a person who was just sort of lower middle class, you send them out into the colonies, they can live an affluent life and they can have extraordinary privilege that would be denied to them if they had stayed, you know, back in the core, right? And they always would tell themselves, well, someday I'll go home, someday I'll go home. No, they won't, because if they go home, they go back to a wretched lower middle class existence where their lives are nothing like as good as they are in the colony. Yeah, Albert Mini, fascinating things about colony back in the 1950s. Frantz Fanon talks about this. We'll talk a little bit about Fanon and the psychology of colonizer and colonized. It's really fascinating. Again, a guy with whom I argue a lot. You know, I have the unfair advantage of still breathing, but you know what I mean? In other words, I don't just accept everything that Frantz Fanon says, but I am compelled by every sentence he writes to think. And that's what I want the value of these things to be for you. Okay? So anyway, that's really, I mean, that's kind of it. You can think a little bit about, he passes over the concept of internal colonization and things like that. It's not that those are not important, but those are nuances that we can sort of set aside and mumble through, a la Professor Peterson. Do you have any questions then about where we are right now? All Hal is doing is trying to, it's the opening ceremonies, right? He's saying, okay, everybody, this is what the Olympics are going to look like. The torch has just been lit. All right, now the competition has not yet begun, but we've agreed that these are going to be the events. We're going to talk about empire. We're going to talk about colonies. We're going to talk about, you know, whatever we're going to talk about, these terminology. That's what I wanted you to get out of that first chapter. So what I would suggest is that by the time we meet again on Tuesday, am I right? Yeah, I got to be careful because as some of you who've had classes with me know, I mean, days mean nothing to me. Even less so now that I'm in, you know, Casa Hughes here. By then, I would like you to be kind of done with making. I'll tell you what, I'll leave those things accessible to you until at least class time on Tuesday, just in case you have a hectic weekend, or like me, maybe you end up having to go back to California to help people get out of those fires or whatever, you help them move. There's a lot of stuff going to go on my weekend. Some of you may be in the same situation, and I totally understand that. I don't want the deadline to be the thing. I want the substance of the chapter to be the thing. Okay. So is there anything else, either specific to the chapter or more broadly in terms of the class and where we're going, that you're not sure about?
Actually, I had one question about the Module 1 summary. Is that aspect being graded, or should we have taken notes in a specific way? Because I basically just copied and pasted as I wrote, if not like sections from the book. So I just want to make sure that like that's okay, because I'm not obviously going to.
Oh, no. It's I think you were not in class at the time we first talked about that. I think you hadn't made it in yet or something. I can't remember.
Okay.
But, I should have remembered to email you or something on that. I thought about it.
Okay.
Forgot. AJ, I'll get you in 1 second. No, it's only to your advantage. It's just that I want to make sure that I create just a little bit of a sense of urgency so that you actually do what you just said you did. If you're just cutting and pasting, that's fine. Just remember, though, that when it comes time to do the midterm, any of that stuff you've cut and pasted, make sure that you cite it, author, date, page number, okay? Avoid plagiarism. Treat it like a short research assignment, but sure, that's fine. You can do it any way you want. And you might get a caution from me if I look through there and I see that maybe you've really missed a point, or maybe you don't understand or don't appear to understand. I might leave a comment for you or something. Beyond that, it's primarily for you. AJ, what did you have in mind there?
I was just curious, on 31, he talks about how a little bit of neocolonialism was kind of fallen by the wayside. Like it was a super ideological term, like a lot of shit around it. So maybe not a good argumentative term, but what word has kind of replaced neocolonialism to explain that? Like I know dependency theory gets thrown around, but
I can give you two.
Okay.
One is dependency.
Okay.
The other one is globalization.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious what the more proper modern term would be.
Well, if you've taken or remember the readings from the 355 class, one of the things that I assign in there is an article that a lot of students find incredibly impenetrable, because it does have all this terminology, but also because the author is really trying to do a good thing. He's trying to say, there are these different schools of thought on globalization, and they're not all happy shiny. Some of them they're more like post-Marxist or neo-Marxist, or, dependency. There's a dependency version of globalization. So often, instead of neocolonialism, what you hear is globalization. But it becomes more of if it's used in a normative sense, it becomes more of a pejorative. So that would be one. Now, if I hear you use neocolonialism, I'm not going to jump out of the bushes and scare you and say, no, you can't use that. But all I want you to be able to do is make sure that the context within which you use it helps us to understand how you intend it to be understood, either in your writings or in comments in class. If you use the language that works, okay? I'm not offended when I hear the term neocolonialism, but I also understand it has a problematic conceptual history. And you're right, AG. That's exactly what Hal is concerned about with all of these terms. See, it sounds, we have a couple of advantages here that make me very optimistic about this. One of them is, and I'm not being condescending either, this is a really smart group of people. Okay, we're lucky. Teaching a class like this when you got a bunch of people who aren't interested or don't care or don't have any background is a drag. I know, because I've done it. But the other thing is, it sounds like a critical mass of you have by now begun to dig into this material, okay? And as long as that happens, these classes are going to be fine. They're going to teach themselves pretty much, okay? Except that Jennifer has to change completely the way she thinks, and I think we all agree on that.
One, I guess maybe two questions, but one about how would you use globalism, it's used instead of post-colonial or instead of neocolonialism? Is the idea of America making their new military?
Made an interesting conceptual distinction between globalism and globalization. Before which I must say, Jennifer, did you understand that I was joking?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's the weird thing when I can't see when I think, because ready, fire, aim. That is the Hughes mantra. First problem, Professor Peterson, is globalism is almost more ideological. In other words, globalism can be thought of like imperialism. It is either the facilitation of or the justification of, one or the other or both, the process of globalizing to your advantage. You become a globalist usually if you're advocating it. Okay. Now, globalization is a phenomenon that can be analyzed dispassionately. You're not you need not be advocating it. Some do. Okay, some people who are analyzing or purport to be analyzing globalization are advocating it. But in good faith, the analyst is going to say, well, this is what I understand globalization to be. This is kind of where, this is what it looks like. This is how it began. This is why it began. This is what it seems to be creating or destroying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you would replace neocolonialism with. That doesn't make sense to make the jump from.
I wouldn't.
From those two words. I wouldn't either, which is my thing. I was like, I didn't think it made very much sense.
But you will hear people, this is the imperfection of scholarship, and this is, in aggregate, this is exactly what Howe is concerned about. People throw these terms out, and his biggest culprits are the lit crit people, the literary criticism people, or the Foucaults and the Baudrillards. I don't think he likes the French at all, but that idea of what we mean is this, and it's like, well, what does it mean though, man? You could say the same thing of Marxists and all this kind of stuff. But the reason why some people will excise neocolonialism and say globalization is because neocolonialism sounds evil. But we know that one of the visible modalities of globalization is that you are functionally going in and transplanting your influence. You're projecting your influence.
You're shipping out your culture.
Often,
that's the whole point, right? Like,
no, you're doing it often to its detriment. Now, you may be doing it for completely commercial reasons. That is, you may not be seeking political domination, which is normally what we think of as colonialism. But when you understand that by exporting your values, you can do harm, or in fact, as is often the case, you're exporting your values because you want to see political change, like trying to stimulate liberalism in Iran, for example. That's not value neutral. We're trying to bring down a government. And the theory is all they have to do is listen to enough heavy metal music and they'll do our work for us. I mean, really, it's amazing the things that you will hear people in the CIA say, but I mean, metal would do it. If it didn't burn them down, I think it would shatter the Ayatollahs. The creepy thing about metal is so much of it has that weird kind of grim Old Testament vibe that might be just as creepy. But that idea that, if you just watch, American television or see American values or look at American capitalism and see American affluence because we have just enough of it that we can show it to people, then you'll want to be like us, and you'll want so badly to be like us that you'll overthrow, the machine. Okay. Which takes us right back to the original impetus of colonialism in the first place. It's exactly what Johanna suggested. The accumulation of wealth, the expansion of economic power. Well, you've got to project political force to do that because once you've acquired that wealth, you have to protect it. Another thing that Howe's not explicit about, without securing rights to private property, empire is meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. Going well beyond his text, you could make a compelling argument that the voyages of discovery and the opening up of the modern notion of empire and colonies could only have happened with the weakening of monarchs and the strengthening, the concomitant strengthening of the commercial classes. That is, look, this is all about the Benjamins. That's it. It's not about aggrandizing your name or spreading your joy or anything else. Yeah, we'll let you tack onto this, and we'll let you co-sign for it. But this is about us becoming wealthy. The hell with you. And that really begins to be the driving force. That is the emergence of capitalism. It's why Lenin described imperialism as monopoly capitalism. The logical extrapolation of monopoly capitalism is imperialism. Well, see, I would more so than Howe be tempted to concede that modern imperialism is that. Because when people come and say, yeah, but that doesn't explain the Ottomans, and it doesn't explain Rome, and it doesn't explain China. Yeah, because capitalism didn't exist yet. So there. you know, but I'm willing to be persuaded. It's an interesting argument, though. Specific to Kyle's concern, though, the muddying of those two terms, neocolonialism and globalization, can be pernicious. It can be a problem. The very fact that you're stopping to think about that obviates the likelihood that it's going to be a problem in your own work. But we have to do that with every one of these concepts. That's the main caution we're getting from Howe. Man, before any word comes out of the front of your head, make sure it's as close to the right word as you can get. So Kyle, I'm agreeing with you. It can be problematic. But what I was saying in responding to AJ is, what are the terms that people use, whether or not they should, right? One of them is globalization. Another one is dependency. And yet there are a number of people who would say, no, dependency doesn't work. It doesn't explain Singapore. It doesn't explain South Korea. You know, it doesn't explain what's happening in Vietnam right now, and on and on and on, you know. The challenge is that there's no magic formula here that you're going to get that's going to explain the world. That's not what we're doing, because human beings just have their own ways of doing things. And that changes across time, and it changes in different parts of the world for different reasons. I think, though, that I would lean into the idea of the fundamental motivation for all of this being disproportionately material, economic. When you read Engels, Anti-Düring, I just went back and read Engels, Anti-Düring. It was hilariously funny, and which is weird, you know, acid flashback, you know. And he's talking about Düring and responding to him. And Düring has this weird thing that he goes into about force. And well, you know, he was talking about Robinson Crusoe. And Robinson Crusoe was able to subdue Friday because he had his sword. And so Engels is like, well, where did he get the sword? Well, why doesn't Friday just come back the next day with a gun? So what he's saying is, it's about the means of production, right? In other words, it was the means of production that created that sword, that created the advantage and the imperative for that advantage. We need this advantage. This means of production requires that we expand outward, that we acquire more land, labor, and capital. Okay, that's what Lenin, you know, rockhead that he was talking about. That you don't have, he's essentially arguing, you don't have modern empire without capitalism. Now, the logical rejection of that at the time he's writing and for the 20th century is the Soviet Union itself. That's where a lot of people disagree. They say, well, no, what about the Soviet Union? That ain't capitalism. It's monopoly. That might be part of it. The more accurate thing might have been monopoly industrialization, maybe. But I'm saying it's a compelling argument, but it doesn't end the discussion. As cool as it is, as provocative as it might be, it's not like, okay, I've got this thing dialed. All you have to do is read Marx and Lenin, and you don't even have to understand them, and we're done. All right, so none of this stuff is easy. I think it's all pretty compelling, though. All right, is there anything else? Any other questions? Well, monopoly of ownership or production, monopoly of ownership of the means of production. You own the way things that are produced. Yeah, that's the Marxist notion. Now, obviously, a capitalist isn't going to want to hear that, but, you know, they'll get over it, you know. Okay, but that's an important distinction. Yeah, it's not just production, it's the means of production. In other words, real wealth is not, hey, you know, I have $1,000 in the bank. Real wealth is, I control the apparatus that produces that wealth. That's real power. That's what a Marxist would call the ruling class. Okay, all right. So there's more we can get into, but we've got plenty of time to do it. I don't want us ever to feel rushed in this class. I like the idea that, you know, we took a while to get through this stuff, even though it's only 30 pages. As you can see, we can go as deeply as we want to into this stuff. There's a lot there, and it gets richer as we go. There's just more to chew on. The last thing then that I want to mention, okay, and look, come on, I haven't even kept you an hour yet. Okay, the last thing is very important. I want to remind you is I want to remind you that there is not only a midterm in here, but the other significant assignment is your case study of colonialism. Okay, now you have you know, in the syllabus there's an explanation of the things I want you to look for and the things I want you to, the questions I want you to be able to answer. Okay, but I wouldn't wait very long to start that. Just start it in a preliminary way. Decide what colonial experience you want to analyze. And then maybe get on the CIA World Factbook, and that'll give you little snippets about what its economy was like, what its colonial history was, stuff like that. Maybe get on the Hannon Library and don't look for books, but look for articles that might deal with the colonial period of that particular country, and just get a little background. Also, I tend routinely, and have been for the last year or so, but particularly when I started writing this class, amassed a series of articles about the colonial experience in different places around the world. So I may have access either to authors whose work you can look for or stuff like that. I may be of help to you. So if you get to the point where you're thinking, I kind of like to look, I'm really interested in this whole notion of British colonialism in Kenya and the settlers population there, the white minority rule in Kenya and the response to that being Mau Mau and all that. And I want to know more about that. Where would I go to look for that? If you are hitting a wall, shoot me an email. And I can probably, that is a case that I've looked into a lot, more so, for example, than Tanzania or something like that. But also, obviously, Angola, Mozambique, a lot of work recently on Laos, a lot of work on Vietnam, a little bit of work on Burma, Myanmar, because I've tried to. Where I am admittedly very weak, oddly enough, is in South America. It's never been as interesting to me. Maybe because it's just too close to home and it's just not as exciting. Okay, so I can be of help to you, is what I'm saying. Don't worry if you're really floundering. Just shoot me an email, and if we can set up a Zoom office meeting or whatever and talk about it a little bit. We'll get you there, but don't wait too long. Okay. All right. Anything else? Before you go, did everybody sign in using the chat? If not, I will mark you. I won't know, and I will mark you absent. Make sure that you've done that. If not, then do it now before you go. I'm going to wait about a minute, and then I'm going to kick you all out of here. So obviously, I'm done. If you want to just bail, go ahead. But I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to do this. Okay? It looks like Johanna just did it. Cool. Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, I'm waiting. Everybody done? All right, we're done.